G'day guys, Mike with the Outer Circle. This is the second video in this series where we're taking different legions and we're comparing their powers and basically talking about how you rank a legion's abilities, traits, specialist units, the works, in order to assess where they sit on the strength spectrum. The reason we do this is not in order to create the most powerful army or anything like that kind of concept. We do it so that people can understand how we look at a unit and assess their value on the tabletop. This allows us to understand how our rules work better. It also allows us to understand how units interact with one another on the tabletop. It also lets us know where there are strength imbalances within the game, which is why we started this with the Imperial Fists, because in my opinion they are the strongest of the Legionaries Astartes, and that gives us a really great baseline to work off with every single other legion. And there are quite a few that are up there with them when it comes to strength. The Salamanders are not, and that's why they're the second video, because this legion is one of two that I've been playing a bit in this edition. So we're going to start, like with the previous video, with legion traits. So we want to see a combination here of two factors, versatility and repeatability. For a trait to be considered strong, it should apply for multiple units and affect a wide variety of situations without the difficulty of use. Traits like the Thousand Suns ability, which applies to a squad and its leaders only, and then if the leader dies, then the squad is locked off, is an example of a trait which is bad to outright terrible in this regard. For the Salamanders, they have a two-part trait. The first being that it affects only units with, or units with wounds characteristics essentially, and the second affects multi-wound and multi-hull point units. So the first part is that all rolls to wound made against the Salamanders with flame, plasma, volkite and melter weaponry only does so at -1. So a strength 4 flamer fired at a Salamander of toughness 4 would wound on a 4 normally, but is reduced to a 5 by the -1 dice modifier. The second part of their legion trait is that a unit gains It Will Not Die 6+. This is a mediocre rule unless it is stacked to become better, and sadly comes into play very little in games I've played, as one chance per turn on a model to regain a single wound is not enough at such a low chance of success. Generally, tanks in this edition are so easily killed that they even lack the chance to use this ability, making it functionally useless. It shouldn't be called It Will Not Die, it should be called It Will Not Apply. To circle back to the first part of this trait, that -1 modifier is only to the dice roll, not to the stats of the weapon. So weapons like melter guns are still strength 8 and thus instant death versus toughness 4 units. This also would negate the use of it when it comes to It Will Not Die, as a Marine will not be left alive if you shot with a melter weapon to even get any functional use from It Will Not Die. So again, making it a worse legion trait. Additionally, the other weapons on this very short list are not commonly used this edition, with the exception of Volkite, which has retained quite a bit of popularity and thus is the weapon against which this trait actually best applies. The best comparison to make, therefore, is to the Iron Hands Legion, and their trait, which is a flat -1 strength to all attacks from all ranged weapons. It's versatile, and whilst the Salamanders is very restrictive, and as the weapons are half arguably bad in this edition or half hardly affected by the Salamander's trait, we're left in this unique position where the Iron Hands respond better against most attacks made by those types of weapons than the Legion theoretically best suited to facing them. There are a few exceptions to this, however, and that is worth noting, but they are so rare and so situational that it doesn't pass the test of versatility or repeatability that we judge on. As a last note on the Legion trait, this trait does not apply in all situations, but it does apply in close combat. However, the only weapons which have a defined type in close combat, such as flame or melter, are melter bombs, which are mostly used on vehicles, where this trait actually does not apply, and dreadnoughts. And of course, Blood Angels, Perdition weapons, as they count as flame attacks. Sadly, close combat weapon types are not well utilised in this edition, and I think expanding on this would have been a better route to take in the game than, say, Brutal was. But it's worth noting, despite the fact it will almost never come up, for the sake of fairness and transparency. The Salamanders, therefore, have a very poor Legion trait, in that it is highly restrictive, only applying to some units in some situations, and only against 4 weapon types when the most common and most devastating weapons in the game are completely unaffected. Warlord traits. Like most forces, there are 3 traits to pick from. The first is the Loyalist only trait, the Weight of Duty, which grants +1 strength to the Warlord and his unit, which sounds great on the surface until you realise it only counts against units that cause fear. Additionally, this trait locks off units like destroyers, Moritats and such. It does helpfully confer hatred against all traitors to the Warlord's unit, meaning that a chaplain isn't required for his particular unit. An additional reaction is granted in the assault phase as well. This ability is therefore quite restrictive overall, and thus does not pass the viability test. The second trait is Promethean Will, and it grants +1 leadership army-wide versus leadership caused by things like pinning, as well as removing 1 point of fear from enemy units in the opposing army. You also gain a shooting reaction, which is the best kind of reaction to get, but you suffer from the same restriction on Moritats and Destroyers. As this trait affects the entire army, not just the Warlord's unit, and it's a useful stat line, leadership, and it outright negates something like the Night Lords and Demons' key strengths, I think this is actually one of the best Warlord traits in the entire game. It passes on versatility, it affects everyone, it affects multiple situations, it's repeatable, it's viable, it's a good trait. Lastly, the Redemption of Flames Warlord trait, which is traitor only, grants you +1 on your to-wound rolls when you use Flamer and Volkite weapons, but this only applies to the unit the Warlord joins, which is already poor, but also, out of the 4 types of weapons mentioned in the Legion trait, 2 of them seem to have been forgotten, as has the Melter Mastery the Salamanders are known for, meaning that they only really have Flamers and Volkite weapons, which wound on 1 die slower than they normally would. So now most of your Flamer weapons will wound elite units on 2s, or Dreadnoughts on 5s. Hardly game shaking, and as Warlords tend to join Death Star units like Fire Drakes, who will likely be taken with Thunderhammers and Storm Shields, you're not going to grant this bonus very often, so it's a truly pathetic Warlord trait. Advanced reactions. The Salamanders have a very interesting Legion trait. Duty is sacrifice. Now, this particular advanced reaction trait, it grants the unit +1 to weapon skill, strength, and attacks for the duration of that fight. But afterwards, you must roll a d6 for each model, and on a 6, take a wound with no armor saves or mitigation rolls allowed. Quite safe to use on Terminators, and maybe a rare situation where models may actually use the It Will Not Die that you're given as a part of your Legion trait. I actually highly rate this advanced reaction, as I like it thematically, as actually having a risk and reward, not just a flat reward, which is what most advanced traits are, is a really good thing from a gameplay design perspective. And at the same time, it is a strong enough thing that you can justify it having a downside. More advanced reactions like this, please. It's fantastic. Legion War Gear. There are 2 categories of war gear here, offensive and defensive. For offense, you have the ability to change any heavy bolter to a Dragon's Breath heavy flamer. In addition to this, all flamers in the Salamanders change to a Dragon's Breath version of the same weapon, which is generally 1 strength higher, and in the case of the hand and normal flamers, they're also 1 AP lower for some reason, but this didn't get passed on to the stronger weapons, probably because the company is afraid of AP 2 and 3 weapons. The gimmick is that these weapons gain D6 hits on Overwatch, which sounds great, but it's actually highly situational. For a start, you have limited ability to perform Overwatch, and reactions can be shut down, and of course any unit which charges over more than 8 inches is actually not subject to Flamer Overwatch. The general widespread adoption of both the heavy rule, allowing failed armor saves to be re-rolled, as well as extra wounds being widespread, means that Dragon's Breath weapons almost never actually cause damage in the standard game, except against units that a normal Flamer would have already performed well against. The one exception to this is units with a 4+ armor save, where they suddenly become very, very strong. Dragon's Breath heavy flamers in particular are the bane of Solar Auxilia and Ruin Storm alike. In 9 games out of 10, these weapons are going to do nothing, but at least they're free. But in that 1 game out of 10 where you face someone like Solar Auxilia, your opponent is legitimately going to have negative fun, and you will owe them at least 1 beer per turn to dull the pain. Item number 2 is the Dragon Scale Storm Shield, a relatively cheap way to get +1 invulnerable save, capped at 3, but disabling that extra close combat weapon or two-handed weapon, exactly what you'd expect from a shield. Whilst objectively inferior to the Imperial Fist Shield, despite being the Artificer Legion who created the Storm Shield, it's still cheap and rock solid, and you will take them wherever you can. Interestingly though, the Storm Shields on Indomitus Terminators have the exact same points cost and stat boost, so I'm going to guess that all Legions got the technology thanks to the Salamanders. The last item here is a very expensive 35 point upgrade, and it's for your Praetor only, and it grants you Battle Hardened 1, which makes you safe from all those pesky Strength 8 instant death hits, but importantly here, because this is very specific to Praetors, who are most likely to come up against these, it will not save you from murderous strike weapons like the Paragon Blade, who will be on the Praetor opposite you in a challenge, and it does literally nothing else to buff you. It's also functionally useless versus Imperial Fists and Custodes Soulrite Gauntlets, which are strength 10, and you also have to be aware of Rad Grenades, which will nullify this ability and cost less than a third of the points of this item. If it was 10 points, I would say it's a must-take, but at 35 points it is far, far too expensive and situational for its use. So all in all, I can best summarise the Salamander's war gear as lacking, with no emphasis by the writers placed upon master crafting of weapons, as well as forgetting that Salamanders are also known for melter weapons, and for not giving them any bonuses in that category. The Salamanders are barely better kitted out than a generic legion with no special war gear, and I consider this a bit of a travesty. Legion consuls now. Unlike many other legions in the game, the Salamanders did not get a particular legion consul. Instead, they got their own unique psychic power, which is an upgrade for a legion librarian in place of another discipline. The first power that they have, on condition of passing a psychic check, creates a bubble within 18 inches of the psyker, which makes all open terrain into difficult terrain, and all difficult terrain into difficult and dangerous terrain. This power shuts down the Psyker's ability to do basically anything else. No moving, no shooting, no close combat, none of it. And despite the minor benefits of this power, legions like the Dark Angels can actually do this for free for the entire game, for almost the entire table, without paying for a librarian, trying a psychic check, or wasting the unit standing still. The second power is a Strength 7 Flamer attack, with the gimmick being Shell Shock of 3, Pinning, and Deflagrate. But as it's neither Rending nor Strength 8 and it's only AP 4, you're not going to cause wounds to cause the pinning check. And it requires that the Psyker is in 8 inches of the enemy, and being within 8 inches of the enemy, getting that close of proximity, then attempting the test and hoping the target will somehow fail a wound, it's not going to happen. It is way too niche of a power to justify the investment of your Psyker into this discipline over the dominant power of telepathy. This psychic discipline is utterly useless in the scheme of the game, and sadly it is really hard to apply on the tabletop, meaning it isn't even fun for narrative lists. I think it's actually a clear example of writers misunderstanding the core rules and probabilities when writing. Now we come to the Legion Elites, and I feel it's time to actually turn this franchise around, as the one category where the Salamanders truly excel is in their very few special units. Pyroclasts are a cross between destroyers and heavy support, and make use of a weapon which grants them Dragon's Breath heavy flamers or melter guns. Both are viable and both have their uses. They're viable here because of different situations you might find yourself in, such as fighting Solar Auxilia or Legiones Astartes. Pyroclast overwatching with melter guns is enough to give pretty much any Legion's Terminators pause for thought on the charge. They come with Artificer armor, their Legion trait is boosted to a 5+, it will not die, which means it might actually go off, and their invulnerable save is 5+ against the same sort of weapons listed in their Legion trait, which is a nice little side boost. So are they good? Well, compared to a tactical support squad, who is very, very similar to them in equipment, who is armed with a melter gun, you would cost 3 points more, but you gain, in addition to that melter gun, a heavy flamer, an extra wound, an extra attack, a free close combat weapon, taking you to 3 attacks base, 4 on the charge. You get the heavy type, a 2+ save, a boosted it will not die, extra leadership, and a situational invulnerable save. So yeah, for 3 points, that's worth it. It is far, far beyond a steal, and you can also perform this same comparison against heavy support marines where they also come out on top. A fantastic unit, and the only letdown is weapon skill 4, but, very importantly, you aren't taking them to fight Palatine Blades in close combat. You take them to roast Palatine Blades to death with melter guns and piss on the ashes with Promethean fire. The Fire Drakes, they're also a good unit. They compare very closely with the Huskarls of the Imperial Fists, costing about the same amount per model, when including Storm Shields, but instead of the Huskarls' built-in Deep Strike and Battle Hardened 1, you get rerolls of a 1 to hit in close combat, and it will not die 5+. The slight it will not die boost is nice, however as the unit isn't composed of characters, it is hard to spread the wounds out in such a way as to really see any benefit from it, versus the flat Battle Hardened of the Imperial Fists. The ability to reroll 1s to hit thanks to Artificer, or to having Artificer weapons, it goes to show the writers didn't forget entirely that Salamanders make some of, if not arguably the best war gear in the Imperium, and it's actually very strong in close combat. Now, is it stronger than built-in Deep Strike? I'm going to argue yes. I would argue it is, because you can at least attach a Warmonger to Salamanders' Fire Drakes in order to make up that difference, if Deep Strike is your flavour. So I think it's almost a wash between these guys and Huskarls, a top tier unit of the highest order. Lastly, there's an exemplary battle unit called the Adherents, who are Legion veterans, minus the special rules and a few stat points being dropped down in order to fit them into a support troops slot. Sadly, these compete with units which actually have line, and their war gear is Dragon's Breath based, meaning they really don't have any killing power. At 20 points each, they have less firepower or close combat attacks than equivalent points in Tactical Marines would. These are the closest thing to a dud unit in the lineup, but for fun and fluff, I wouldn't discount taking a set of them, as they aren't bad, just a bit underwhelming, and even their special rule granting a 50-50 chance of a weapon skill buff isn't quite enough to redeem them. If only they were troops with line, they would be really good. Legion Rites of War. There are 2 Rites of War here. The Covenant of Fire is first up, and it makes your tactical support squads with Dragon's Breath weapons and Pyroclasts both troops and both line. It also moves Predator tanks with all Flamer loadouts into troops as non-compulsory choices. The downside? You have to take a Legion Champion, one of the best consuls in the game. Oh no! And there's also something in there about not deep striking, but ignore that. You're Salamanders. What are you doing here? Why are you contemplating not just taking one of the best Rites of War in the entire game? Go out now, buy some Pyroclasts, and start committing arson in the confines of your 6x4 games table. Anyway, there's also another Rite of War which I'm legally obligated to mention, the Awakening Fire. It is a poor attempt to make Salamanders into Night Lords by granting Fear 1 at a whopping 20 points per unit, which is twice as much as the Night Lords pay for reference. You don't take any negative pinning modifiers, which is nice, and your Psychic Discipline is opened up to all Psykers in your detachment. If you want to take an Esoterist and throw away the one thing you would take them for over Librarian, this is your choice. You can also take a Chaplain or a Centurion, which does not take up a HQ slot, which is kind of neat. But downsides? No cavalry, that's bikes, jet bikes, no jump packs, no Primarch, not that it really matters, and you must take a chaplain or a centurion. Not a great trade-off for the option to pay 20 points for Fear 1, and this Rite of War should be consigned to the bin, or better yet, use the Covenant of Fire list you just built to burn this one to the ashes. Legion named characters. There are 3 Legion named characters. You would not know this if you bought the book, as they are located in the PDF Legacies of the Age of Darkness, which you have to download from a tab on the Warhammer community page. Already a poor start. Then you see the stats. Starting with Cassian Dracos Reborn, he had 2 versions in Heresy 1, and sadly due to changes in 2.0 he lost one of them. In this edition, you have the finest Dreadnought chassis ever created, handcrafted by the Primarch Vulcan himself, represented by a standard box Dreadnought stats and 310 points in cost. There is nothing more to really say here, other than he used to be worse, and was so bad the writers actually buffed him to get him to just this level. Avoid him at all costs. You would actually be better off to run a Leviathan Dreadnought with 2 fists and all Flamer and Melter weapon loadout, and say it counts as him, and it would actually be far closer to the fluff, better in every single stat line, and surprisingly also 30 points cheaper than whatever the fuck this is. The second character is Lord Chaplain Nomus Righthand, a Praetor level character and the de facto leader of the Legion, Vulcan's number 2 character. This is represented in-game by having a worse than Praetor stat line for some reason. It actually used to be even worse again, having a standard Tactical Marines weapon skill and ballistic skill, and it's been boosted to just 5. And in place of a normal close combat loadout, you get a Thunderhammer crafted by Vulcan himself from minerals taken from the gravitational vortex of a dying world. It's very specific in the fluff. That doesn't sound so bad, does it? It probably has an amazing stat line, you'd imagine, like the Thunderhammer created by Fulgrim, another Primarch who is not really renowned for his blacksmithing skills. Well, here's the catch. It's only +2 strength, not double strength. And it's also 2-handed weapon, so you don't get any bonus attacks. Oh yeah, and it isn't brutal. So yeah, it's one of, if not the worst character weapon in the entire game. Remember, this guy costs as much as Sigismund, a guy whose weapon is the same strength as this, fights at initiative, causes instant death, forces you to reroll successful armor and invulnerable saves. Yeah, okay, so maybe right hand isn't cut out for close combat. What's his range war gear like? It's got to be good, right, to make up for it. He has a combi flamer. Oh, but it's at least Dragon's Breath, right? Like the Salamanders adherents have. No, it's a stock combi flamer, same as every Legion can purchase on a Praetor. Okay, so he probably has amazing buffs for the army, right? Sure. Yeah, he has hatred. Okay, but what about his Warlord trait? He's got to have a good Warlord trait. The Salamanders at least have the Promethean will. Yeah, his Warlord trait, he allows Dreadnoughts, specifically only Dreadnoughts who are Salamanders, by the way. And if they're within 6 inches of him, then they get to increase their charge by 2 inches. That's it. You pay 215 points for this character, and I feel the need to remind you at this point, this is a masterclass in how to not write characters, and should be printed out and then glued on the wall next to every Horus Heresy writer's desk, so they can hopefully learn from these mistakes. Their last and best special character is Xiphus Jur, a chaplain who can use his leadership on 1 Salamander's unit each turn. He has a power maul with the blind rule, so AP 3 non-rending attacks at strength 6. A storm shield, and can use pyromancy at leadership 7, which is pretty dicey. You pay for a chaplain and get a poor librarian instead, and it costs the same points as paying for a centurion and buying both chaplain and librarian console upgrades. And this is the best character you have at 145 points. Let that sink in. This is the only Legion in the game where you can make a better character for each one of these by simply taking a stock HQ option instead and arming them identically. Even the Dreadnought character is beaten out by a Fury of the Ancients Warlord Contemptor or a stock Leviathan Dreadnought. So putting it all together, unlike the Imperial Fist where we were able to say you have infinite options of combining things, and there's one super strong and easy Rite of War and a bunch of other good ideas, the Salamanders have one default, and players will gravitate towards it Not if they want to win, but just if they want to be competitive and not tabled every single game. You're going to take a Covenant of Fire Rite of War. Your Warlord is taking a Thunderhammer and Storm Shield, and he's joining a unit of Fire Drakes. You're taking a champion in there who has a Paragon Blade and a Storm Shield, and you're going to put them in a Spartan for movement. Then you're going to fill the rest of your army with Pyroclasts and occasionally take a tactical support squad with Flamers to hold objectives. You're going to sprinkle Contemptors where you can, if you want to be a little bit stronger, or you're taking Land Raiders as Pyroclasts, dedicated transports if you want to soak up some points instead. You're always going to take Promethean Will Warlord trait as it stands out clearly from the crowd. This is it. This is what it means to play a Salamanders army in 2.0. It's an army which lives or dies entirely based on special units and taking the exact right Warlord traits. You're the only Legion which gets appreciably weaker from taking special characters, and you have no tangible bonuses to speak of, and generally, you are one of the weakest Legions alongside the Raven Guard, only propped up, like the Raven Guard, by excellent special units. But woe betide anyone who plays anything weaker than the Astartes against you, because you will transform on the spot from one of the worst Legions into one of the best in that very, very particular situation.
Hey, old man, give me everything.
Call an ambulance! Call an ambulance! But not for me!
So that's it from me, Mac with the Outer Circle. Thank you all for watching this episode, and I'll catch you on the next one.